Before we begin, I'd like to thank Foreign Policy Institute Director, Professor Carla Freeman, Merrill Center Director, Professor John McLaughlin, faculty co-leads, Professor Mara Carlin and Professor Thomas Frid for their support of this program. And thank you also to Merrill Center Administrator Marie Foster and Professor McLaughlin's research assistant, Savannah Dickinson, for their support as well. Today we'll be welcoming three prominent senior experts from India who will discuss how strategy is understood, taught, debated, and practiced across Indian civilian and military institutions. We're also welcoming our moderator today, Professor Daniel Markey. Professor Markey is also a senior fellow with the South Asia program at the Stimson Center. And prior to joining Stimson, he served as a senior advisor at the U.S. Institute of Peace, where he focused on India politics, South Asian security, and China's regional policies. Professor Markey also launched and led SAIS's MAGP program, was a senior fellow for India, Pakistan, and South Asia at the Council on Foreign Relations, and a member of the State Department's policy planning staff. He is the author of China's Western Horizon, Beijing, and the New Geopolitics of Eurasia, and No Exit from Pakistan, America's Tortured Relationship with Islamabad. Professor Markey will lead a discussion with our speakers, and then we'll open it up to your questions around 12:30, 12:45. So please start thinking about your questions now and observations as the discussion begins. If you're joining us online, feel free to use the chat. And if you are joining us in person, you'll be able to ask those directly. And as Marie noted, this event is being recorded, so the event is on the record. Markey, over to you.
Great. All right. Thanks, Stephanie. And thanks also to Stephanie for planning this and making all of it possible and for including me in the conversation here today. So as all of you as students here at SAIS know, strategy is not a universal language. Dominant frameworks in American strategic education were, of course, built from specific experiences of wars, of alliances, decades of predominance, and moments of anxiety. American strategic education has its canonical texts. We all think of Clausewitz, Schelling. So those carry with them certain assumptions that are not always visible to those who are within a single tradition. The question that we're here to ask and hopefully shed some light on today is whether Indian strategic thinking offers a distinct or alternative view. Arguably, India's canonical thinking could draw from a literature on questions of power, statecraft, and the use of force that spans millennia. India's modern history also offers a different perspective from that of the United States. Independence, partition, wars with Pakistan, China, management of a nuclear arsenal presumably added their own lessons for Indians. So today we're joined, as Stephanie said, by three experts on Indian strategy and foreign policy. They're very well placed to help us appreciate how India thinks about and teaches strategy. They also provide a comparative context, and collectively, they've served in a wide range of institutional roles, both inside India and overseas. Now, perhaps appropriately, they are joining us from like three corners of the world here today, so not just from India. We have with us Rahul Sagar, who Rahul, I believe, is joining us now from Singapore, if I'm not mistaken, where he's kind of been displaced by the war. He is normally the Global Network Associate Professor at NYU in Abu Dhabi. His essays on India's foreign relations have appeared in International Affairs and Survival, in the Oxford Handbook on Indian Foreign Policy. And his most recent book is To Raise a Fallen People, the 19th Century Origins of Indian Views on International Politics, published by Columbia in 2022. He received his BA from Oxford and his PhD from Harvard, and previously served on the faculty at Princeton and NUS. Are also joined by Happyman Jacob, who is coming to us from Delhi, where he is the founder and director of the Council for Strategic and Defense Research, or CSDR. He is also a distinguished visiting professor at Shiv Nadar University. He previously served on the faculty of Jawaharlal Nehru University, or JNU, in Delhi, He serves as the editor of India's World Magazine, which many of you are probably familiar with, and he's a regular columnist for the Hindustan Times. His works include Line on Fire, published by Oxford in 2019, Line of Control, published by Penguin in 2018, and he has a forthcoming book, India After Non-Alignment, which is set for release this year by Georgetown University Press. And our last but not least speaker today is Anand Mukherjee, and he joins us from London, where he is a senior lecturer at King's College, India Institute. He joined King's after 10 years in Singapore, where he was an associate professor at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies, or RSIS. And he has an MA and PhD from SAIS, where he studied this topic of civil-military relations in India and ultimately wrote the book, The Absent Dialogue, Politicians, Bureaucrats, and the Military in India, published by Oxford in 2019, which also looks at, in addition to civil-military relations, it also looks at questions of military effectiveness. Formerly, he was a major in the Indian Army and is an alumnus of India's National Defense Academy. The plan for today is that I will do a couple of rounds of questions of our three speakers, and then we will open the floor to your Q&A around 12:30. So as we get rolling, please do, those of you in the room, think of questions and observations that you have that you'd like to ask or bring into our broader discussion. Okay, so let's begin. I assume the technology is working with us. I do not see our speakers. How do we flip? Or is that out of my control? There we go. All right.
Hey, Dan.
Now, all right, good to see you. Now I can see you, your surrounding me. It's wonderful. All right, great. Okay. We're good? Okay. So let me kick off with Rahul. I've got the first question for you. And the question is whether there is an identifiable Indian canon or similar on strategic thought. And if so, what texts or thinkers or historical experiences would you not want to leave out, or what are central texts to this canon? And to add to that, for an audience that's based here in Washington, D.C., at least, what might an American educated student find most surprising about this list?
Great. I hope you can hear me fine. Thanks so much for having me, Dan, and thank you, Stephanie, for organizing this. That's a great question to start off with. And I think the most surprising thing is the least surprising thing, which is there's a variety of positions in India. And it's often a mistake to think from the outside that there's one dominant or clear position. And often that's mistakenly thought to be either Gandhi or Nehru from a sort of broad historical perspective. Those are the names that turn up first. In fact, India has a very wide, diverse, and complicated tradition. And so the first thing when they think about a canon for India, the first distinction they need to make is between the ancient and the modern world. So like the Chinese and like Chinese thinking, India has an incredibly sophisticated classical tradition. This is not unlike the Greek and Roman tradition that we're familiar with in the West. The difference is that unlike the Chinese tradition, indeed even unlike the Greek and Roman traditions, which thought intensely about statecraft and have many classics on statecraft, most of Indian thinking in the classical tradition is actually quite conservative. And I mean that with a small c. It tends to worry about how to just preserve the state. It doesn't have expansive views. These are not accounts for how one might build an empire. They're not accounts that get into the great nitty-gritty of warfare or battle. Instead, they sort of address ethical questions. Why do we fight? What's the purpose of war? What are the boundaries of war and domestic life? And the real focus of the Indian classical tradition, unlike, say, the Chinese one, is to teach the ruler that the purpose of politics is to maintain social and moral order. It's not to expand empire. It's not to win in battle and engage in conquest overseas. It's to maintain social and moral order. So it's quite conservative. It's inward looking rather than outward looking. That's the most sort of essential thing to understand about the tradition, the classical tradition. So you have to be aware of it, you have to read it, you have to understand it, but also to see that it has less of a lesser relevance to the contemporary world, which is a world of states and interdependencies and conflict and trade and international connections in the way that the ancient world wasn't. And then when you turn to the modern world, it's not so much any one or two particular texts, and that's often a mistake when people will focus on one person. They'll focus on Nehru and read something by him and then think that's it, or indeed by one of his critics. The modern Indian tradition is really shaped by an experience and not really by a particular text. And the experience that it's shaped by is colonialism or being colonized, the fact of being colonized, which tended to produce two very different reactions to being colonized, to being at the receiving end of international aggression or force. And one of those strands is quite surprising to outsiders. It's not like the way the Americans responded to colonialism or the Chinese or the Japanese did. In each of those cases, the Americans, the Chinese, and the Japanese responded to colonialism by war, by engaging in straightforward either revolutionary or anti-imperial aggression. In the Indian context, when colonialism unrolled, one of the responses, very dominant responses, in fact, which carried through the 1910s, 20s, 30s, and had a history from the previous century, was actually moralistic. It was international politics is terrible, and our purpose as a nation state in the international world should be to minimize the horrors of international politics. We should primarily play a constructive, progressive, moralizing role in international politics. And so when people wonder why India has a nuclear weapons program, yet is so deeply historically, so these resonances of being anti-imperial, anti-nuclear, it's because one of the dominant responses to colonialism was colonialism is bad. We don't want to be like that. The second big response to the colonization experience is what gives you ultimately things like nuclear weapons, strategic doctrines, and the willingness to use force, is the view that, well, we got colonized, Indians got colonized, because they had weak, poorly performing states with very clear, very unclear lines of authority and very limited capabilities. They hadn't modernized their economies or their militaries. They were relying on feudal or semi-feudal forms of taxation, conscription, and warfare. They had to learn from the modern world. That's much more like what we see in China or in Japan, what we see with the Meiji or the late Qing, or what we of course see in the American context in the mid 1700s. Which is we want to learn and understand the best. So the way the Americans rely on the French or the Japanese rely on learning from the Americans, Indians throughout the 19th and early 20th century read American texts and think very carefully, well, not just American, read the entire gamut of Western and some Asian texts, and they try and understand what it is that makes states powerful. And there the response is not moralistic, but it's realistic. States need to be pragmatic. They need to develop economies. They need to develop state capacity and military capability. So when one thinks about the canon in India, the long and short of it is, there's an ancient world whose relevance is somewhat dimmed by the fact that it focused on questions about ethics, the ethics of warfare and the ethics of political life. And in the modern tradition, there are two broad streams, just for the sake of simplicity. One focuses on moralizing because it sees international politics as a messy thing that's unfortunate and regrettable and undesirable, not unlike, say, the Catholic tradition in modern America and in the modern West, or the second position, much more realistic, much more pragmatic, position that'll be familiar to many people in DC. Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks for kicking us off. That was excellent. Definitely a great framework for thinking about the contours and the inputs into Indian strategic thought, or a canon about that. Abhiman, we had talked a bit before. I know you had wanted to chime in on this, so I wanted to give you a chance to comment on this question of the canon and on it if you want to as well. But let me go to Abhiman first.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Stephanie, for having me in this conversation. I think I totally agree with what Rahul has said. I just want to sort of, pitch in one or two very quick points. I totally agree with Rahul on the question of diversity. And if you look at a country like India, and if you can't appreciate the diversity of thought in this country, be it ancient, be it contemporary, I think you will miss the picture that this country is sort of trying to sell you. Be it domestic politics, be it grand strategy, be it thinking about war and peace. I think I just want to sort of also dig a little further in terms of the ancient traditions, and I would say that it is important to also perhaps look at the regional traditions within the sort of ancient world, as it were, and also the diverse religious traditions, as it were. And if you look at the Buddhist tradition, there is a certain thinking about war and peace in the world. If you look at the Mughal tradition, there is a thinking about war and peace in the world. Of course, there is the Hindu tradition, as it were. Then there is, of course, the South Indian, the Western Indian, the North Indian traditions, as it were. So you can have all sorts of variety when it comes to thinking about what do we focus on when we study India's strategic culture or India's strategic thought, as it were. It's not going to be simple, but I think the point is to again. Rahul made this interesting distinction between the modern and the ancient. The focus is perhaps, I think it is perhaps useful to look at the ancient canons and the traditions as some sort of a deep strategic background, as it were, which then can be used to sort of, understand what is happening in contemporary India, as it were. If you were to look at the modern Indian thinking and traditions, or as far as strategic thought is concerned, I would say there is then the left-leaning thinking. There is the centrist, the Congress the nationalist thinking, as it were, during the run-up to the independence in India in 1947, and of course there is the right-wing thinking, and you can find thinkers in each of these across the political divides, left, right, and center, thinking about the world, talking about war and peace, and India's relationship with the world. I just want to sort of put that on the table because the more we try to sort of unpack this country and its diverse traditions, the better it is going to be useful for us to sort of positively complicate the strategic thinking arising out of this country. But with that, back to you, Dan.
Sorry for the up and down here. Anand, I don't know if you wanted to jump in on this or we can move on. It's up to you.
Very quickly, no, I don't have too much to add other than to say that, look, I mean, I think it's a very important topic to look at because there is a real effort now within India, perhaps led in part by the BJP government, to rediscover Indian strategic thinking. I think there are different institutions who have been tasked to do it. And I mean, I know it is a significant part of the effort within the Indian Armed Forces now. And so it's not just rediscovering text, but actually rediscovering our own history. And so I think it is very, very kind of off-topical. But I'll also add that it can also get really complicated and confusing if you get into it, because each of the schools of thought have a different worldview, have a different approach. And so I think the approach which others have worked on, which is different strands of thinking, left, right, centrist, would be a good approach to study it that way. Thanks.
Excellent. Yeah, I'm hearing a lot about diversity of views and different inputs, both from different historical strands within India, different regions, and yet this kind of ancient and modern connection is both fascinating and I think important. I think the next set of questions will help us put a finer point on it to understand how these traditions are actually being taught in India. So I wanted to go to Happyman for this and hear how Indians are educated, particularly at universities or those who end up in think tanks, and how these approaches may differ inside of India. And then, if you wouldn't mind, how you think they might differ most from how, say, we're training students here at SAIS or similar institutions in the United States outside of it.
Thanks, Dan. I'll sort of give it a crack. In fact, I think Anity is someone who has been in all three segments: universities, military academies, and think tanks. But he'd be in a better position to sort of give us more insights. But let me sort of add what I can. Let me sort of begin with the universities. International relations actually is a newcomer in the Indian university system. When we were studying international relations back in the 2000s, there were three universities in India that taught IR as a discipline. In Jadavpur University, in Mahatma Gandhi University in Kerala, Pondicherry, and in Delhi at JNU. But today, I think there seems to be a mushrooming of university departments across India teaching international relations, defense studies, security studies, etc., etc. You have a lot of colleges in India who teach courses on international relations and security studies. I think you're looking at a proliferation of these think tanks. I would say that this is a function of two or three interrelated factors. One perhaps is that there are far more job opportunities today if you study international relations. 20 years ago, if you studied IR, you probably wouldn't be able to find a job, especially in the university system. And secondly, I think the Indian civil service examination from 2013 onwards has made international relations as a subject for the examination. Close to 1 million people apply for this examination, and therefore it has become all the more fashionable today to study international relations. And thirdly, I think there's a lot more public awareness about the impact of international relations, what happens in the world on your own daily lives and on your own domestic politics, etc., especially today. So I think these three forces have somehow accelerated the mainstreaming of IR in India. But I would say despite this growth in the study of international relations, the university teaching in India, I taught in three universities, I'm teaching in a fourth university today. We are heavily dependent on theoretical knowledge drawn from Anglo-Saxon traditions. There are several reasons for it. I think one, because IR is a new discipline in India, so you don't have enough enough material to depend on conceptually speaking, theoretically speaking. And two, because it is only the last 25 years IR has been taken very seriously in the Indian context. We don't have much indigenous theorization that is, I would say, of first rate of that standard. And therefore, we are still dependent on theorization coming out of the United States and North America and Europe, as it were. Unlike, say, disciplines like history and sociology, there's a lot of indigenous theorization in India on history and sociology, but we don't have the same rich tradition of theorization on IR in India. I just want to sort of very quickly talk about military academy and staff college. I occasionally lecture there, but I don't know what really happens there. But my own sense is that the military institutions operate entirely separately from the civilian academy. Occasionally, civilians go there, give a talk, and that's about it. They live in their own universe, in their own world, and the universities live in their own world without much practical experience. There is absolutely no cross-pollination of ideas between the staff colleges and civilian universities. They sort of jealously guard their turfs, as it were. Let's very quickly come to think tanks. The think tanks actually occupy the space between the academic and policy worlds, but they don't teach any strategy clearly. I mean, they only do a little bit of strategic thinking, as it were. I'm now part of a think tank. So what happens in the think tank system in India is that you have conversations and discussions on current strategic issues, contemporary strategic issues, but there is not enough theoretical rigor or conceptual understanding of international relations in general. I think that's the reason why there's a lack of conceptual and theoretical rigor in think tanks in India, is because, I guess, and I know I'm being recorded here, but I'll say it in any case, that's because Indian think tanks are typically headed by former officials whose engagement with IR concepts and theory is somewhat limited. Anity is going to sort of take over a think tank in Delhi as its head, so hopefully things will get better then. So the mode of communication that's coming out of think tanks is de-theorized. No one wants to listen to your theory. No one wants to listen to any conceptually sophisticated argument. They will say, what's the point? And tell me the point, and that's about it. There's no sophistication beyond that. So to sum up, really, I would say that there are fundamental differences between these three approaches: what we have in the university, what we have in the military academies, and in the think tanks. Universities engage with strategy as a body of theory. abstract, borrowed largely from Western traditions, but disconnected from practice. Practitioners don't go into universities, and university folks don't go into let's say institutions that manage foreign policy and strategy in India. The military institutions, they engage with strategy, in my opinion, as an operational craft, right? Practical, experience-driven, disconnected from theory. Most of the instructors there are drawn from the armed forces themselves, so they deal with it as a practical sort of craft, as it were. The think tanks engage with strategy as a policy conversation. It's accessible, it's policy-driven, it's project-driven, disconnected from both theory and the operational depth to some extent, I would say. So each, I think, has a partial grip on the subject, but there is no holistic approach, as it were. So policymakers are removed from strategic thinking in some ways of the theoretical and academic kind. Academics are left to attribute sometimes intents to intents where none exists, and think tanks don't worry too much about theory and practice, theory and concepts beyond a point. Back to you, Dan.
Thank you. That was a fantastic kind of framing of a siloed, at least three silos of a conversation that maybe could be described as an absent dialogue. I don't know. Anit, your name has been raised multiple times already, so I think we need to give you the floor so you can comment both on what Hapiman has already said, but if you wouldn't mind specifically also drawing in some thoughts about the military academies, because again, as Hapiman mentioned, you have experience on the military side, you have experience on the academic side, and then you've also clearly spent time in the States, so you have a comparative vision as well. So over to you.
Thank you so much, Dan. But firstly, I must say thank you for inviting me back to science. It feels good to be home. I am where I am thanks to science, so I owe everything to it. And if there's any credit, it goes completely to science. If there's discredit, it falls completely on me. So I take full responsibility for it. I agree with everything which was said by Hapiman Jacob. But just to add on to that, I think among the most significant difficulties that I faced as a scholar of strategic studies in India, and it's sort of an epiphany that came upon me, was the lack of access to kind of primary documents, right? If you have to study strategic studies in any country, you need to have old declassified documents. I mean, it's an old bugbear of mine. I've been arguing about this for the last 15 years. My friends have stopped talking to me because every time I kind of go back and circle back. But I think it is important to know that in the Indian Armed Forces, there's no proper declassification procedure. What that means is there's no body of officials who go through old files and say, this is to be secret, this is to be redacted, this is to be released. What that potentially means is for scholars in Indian think tanks and the universities, they don't have any, I mean, they have released a lot of files in the National Archives, but the source code, the most important files, which are the operational files, which can be released, right? You can go back to the 47, the first war in Kashmir, the China conflict, the 65 conflict, the Bangladesh war, even all of those documents, or even the Kargil war, which is now kind of 26 years old. Unfortunately, when you do not have access to these documents, scholars in JNU and elsewhere are unable to study. And so strategic studies as a discipline is very difficult to kind of sustain itself. IR is different. IR is still easily done. There's still a fair degree of MEA files, but strategic studies, which is kind of a military defense, it's extremely hard. And to go back to your kind of original point, in terms of the Indian Armed Forces, what they do is they focus, I mean, as was said, on operational craft, on training, and their instructors are mostly all from the armed forces. So I used to say it is ironical. I was in the Indian Army. I have a PhD from the US. I could probably teach, I mean, as I do here, I could probably teach at the Defense Academy in UK. Perhaps if I tried, perhaps I could teach in the US academies, but I would not be able to teach in Indian Defense Services Staff College. There's no kind of facility by which I can go there and teach there or at the Naval War College. And I think that is a shortcoming. That speaks to the different silos that exist across these three think tanks, their universities and the practitioner itself. Thanks, Dan.
Thanks on it. That was super helpful. And again, sort of speaks to this remarkable siloing of different conversations, institutionally at least, in India, which presumably has substantive consequences as well. Rahul, I saw you nodding along with a lot of what was just said. So I don't know if before I ask you another question, if you wanted to pick up on these, or should we move along?
No, you've got the two experts on the subject, and they've said everything that I completely agree with.
Yeah, sort of engage you in since you've spent time outside of India in the neighborhood. Am I right that you're in Singapore right now? Have I got that right?
Yep. Home away from home. Yep, indeed.
Now, so that makes you an expert. You are already an expert on sort of the regional side of things, but as you think about Indian strategic thought, how do you think it compares to how, and I think you mentioned this at the outset, something to do with how, say, Chinese strategic thought is different, with different well springs and consequences as a result of that. So put us in a comparative mode and go back to a little bit of what you were saying, but not just I think mainly you were comparing at the ancients and the earlier traditions, pre-modern traditions. Maybe take us up to speed and speak to those comparisons across, say, between East Asian, or if you want to draw the American, since you studied in the US yourself, the American side of things into it as well.
Yeah, sure. So I think one of the essential features about Indian public life or Indian public culture is Indians read a lot. They read widely, they read a lot, and they read both theoretical texts, but also op-eds, essays widely from not just the US and the UK, though that's dominant. They also read the press and read texts from elsewhere. So there's a great deal of cross-pollination, you might put it that way. There's a lot of careful thinking and absorption of what's being argued elsewhere. And in terms of sort of this broader strategic culture of strategic thinking, this was somewhat already in Happimon's observations. Indians will be, both those that are teaching and those that are studying in India will read many of the classics of the Anglo-American world when it comes to statecraft. And so, in the 90s, any foreign policy officer you met who was sufficiently senior would, immediately start off on Huntington. And today it's Graham Allison, and in the middle it was Fukuyama. So they're reading all the contemporary hot authors, but they're also reading sort of the foundational texts. And these are clearly biased towards the Anglo-American world. But that's if we only look at texts. If you look at experiences, you'll see that Indians have always been very careful and attentive to the experiences of the Japanese, the Chinese, and particularly in Southeast Asia, the Singaporeans, because they want to try and understand what's made these societies successful, wealthy, so what have made the Asian tigers do well, become developed, become capable of projecting influence and power. So language has been a constraint when Indians have tried to think about or be cross-pollinated by intellectual currents in China or Japan. But what transcends language is experience. So Indians travel, visit, engage with think tanks and English language translated texts. And they think very carefully about the East Asian context as well. But whatever they read from the Anglo-American world or view in the East Asian world is interrupted or is kind of has to pass through this filter, which is the Indian context is incredibly different. And it's different for two reasons. One, it's different historically because these societies were never fully colonized. They had to deal with the threat of colonization that caused Japan and China to rapidly modernize. And it caused, as I'd mentioned earlier, the United States to engage in revolutionary war. The Indian experience was incredibly different. And so it's meant that even when Indians read texts or think about the Chinese or Japanese example, they don't see it as something exactly like themselves. They see their history as being quite, in that sense, unique or distinctive because they were colonized and had to find a way into the modern state system through a much more arduous and complicated process. But the second reason, it's not just that their histories are different. The second reason, probably the more important immediate reason, this comes back again to some of the things that Hapiman and Anith were saying, is that the organization of the Indian state is incredibly different from what you get either in the Anglo-American or in the West or in the East Asian case. The state is less institutionalized than it is in the Anglo-American world. It is the establishment, as we so tend to say, or the blub, as some people call it, doesn't quite exist in the Indian context. There is the Indian Foreign Service, but then it's on a very thin, a thin margin. And other state apparatus tend to be not as well performing. The Indian state's also far less cohesive. It's incredibly good. If you threaten territorial integrity, you suddenly discover that the Indian state's incredibly cohesive and incredibly capable. But on most other things, the Indian state's not terribly cohesive. Different arms of the government and different institutions work at cross purposes. They're understaffed. They're underfunded. They're also not, as Hapiman was saying, or not always terribly well trained. So they're not as capable or as skilled. Don't get me wrong, they're very capable on the immediate function of their job, but they're not terribly interested and not terribly incentivized to think about matters of grand strategy. Most people rotate in positions. They're only there for a couple of years. The job is to keep the torch going, to keep the flame burning, not to really set the building on fire. And so because they have a different history and because they have a different institutional context, even though Indians read very widely, if you want to try and understand Indian thinking, you really have to focus on India and what is written or said about India outside India, or what is read or written elsewhere. If you read Stephen Walt or Graham Allison, you can't really export those ideas or that thinking to India because Indian strategic thought occurs in a very different historical and institutional context. So it's dangerously simple to make these transfers and think it'll work. And you'll see people, as I was saying, you'll go to India and you'll get a bureaucrat saying, yes, I've read Huntington, or yes, I've read Graham Allison, but that's very misleading because the world in which they're operating intellectually, historically, institutionally is incredibly different. And so their decision-making tends to operate on very different parameters. And so let me end by just sort of giving you these two examples. I didn't say it the last time. I resisted giving you texts, but let me give you two examples of the kinds of things someone might read if they want to get a sense of the deep processes underlying Indian strategic thought and why that would not be Walt or Allison or Schelling or any of these things. One is a text that almost no one in the audience would have heard of. And it's not even written by a strategic thinker. It's written by India's first great national poet and literature writer. His name was Bankim Chandra Chatterjee. And he has a book called Dharma Tattva, a complicated Sanskrit name, but it means, the English means a defense of Dharma. It's available in an English translation, a defense of Dharma. And it's an account of how India needs to develop a modern state and a modern nation that is patriotic and capable. And it's got a famous line, if you need to eat beef to fight, eat beef, right? And this was it might not, seem all that radical today, but 150 years ago, it was an incredibly radical statement. The other book, which is much more, if you want to try and understand the complexity of India and the churn in India today, is the trilogy by V.S. Naipaul, India's he's not Indian by origin, but India's great an observer of India, one of the most important in the last century. And he has a trilogy of 3 texts on the change in India between 1950 and 1990. And that 40-year span where he writes these 3 texts really helps someone who's unfamiliar with India understand the scale, scope, depth of the change. So that India is undergoing and how that affects the way India thinks about itself in the world. So either Naipaul or Bankim Chandra Chatterjee are my recommendations for if you want to try and understand the deeper foundations rather than relying on this cross-pollination. The texts outside India will tell you something about how Indians think and act, but you really need to read these on-the-ground accounts to understand what are the deeper sources of the deeper motives of Indian action.
Yeah, very helpful. And that complexity is something that it's difficult for us to grapple with here because we want to know, tell us exactly how it's different. But what you're describing is a situation in which there may be shared language in some cases and shared reading, but the thinking behind the reading and the language is affected very differently, and then results in different understandings. And that's difficult to kind of digest without doing more work. Happyman, I want to shift back to you now. If you were thinking about American strategic thought, at least now, it would be probably appropriate to say it was more still Eurocentric and globalized in terms of its way of thinking as kind of fundamental inputs into that thinking. A lot of the authors themselves have fixed on questions, say, of the Cold War, of global conflict, less so localized, say, near neighborhood conflicts. But India, for its modern history, has mainly engaged, at least militarily, in localized conflicts, particularly with respect to Pakistan and at least on occasion with China. So I wonder, as you think about Indian strategic thought, whether the local or neighborhood weighs more heavily in the minds of Indian strategic thinkers than the global, or perhaps not.
Thank you, Dan, for that question. I would sort of agree with the framing of that question. I think there is a distinction that Indian strategic thinking makes between the region and the world in general. The Indian strategic thought is deeply shaped by regional security concerns, be it threat perception, deterrence, war fighting, escalation management. All these conversations are about what happens in the subcontinent. It is India and Pakistan primarily, and a little bit of China. And here is the interesting part. So it is not as if India does not think about the world. India does think about the world. But that thinking about the world in general is about the global south, its positions on multilateral institutions, climate finance, UN Security Council reform. So when it comes to questions of governance, when it comes to questions of institution building, we talk in general international terms. When it comes to the question of the region, we talk in terms of deterrence, war fighting, escalation management, etc. So there is a clear divide in the Indian thinking when it comes to how it thinks about the region and how it thinks about the world in general. So in other words, India firefights in the region, but builds institutions globally. It thinks about security regionally, but it ideates about governance globally. It has a hard power behavior in the region, but it has a soft power moral normative behavior globally. The thing is, these are not very well integrated tracks in some ways. If you look at India's regional behavior, India has not been able to behave like a benign hegemon precisely because it makes a distinction between how its behavior is going to be tolerated in the region, how its behavior is going to be tolerated internationally. It knows it can get away with certain things in the region. It cannot get away with those things internationally. So it depends on the time and space that sort of defines the Indian strategic behavior in that sense. Let me also sort of come back to the second part of the question, which is the assumptions that sort of frame the discussions in India about escalation risk and constraints. As I said earlier, I think there is a clear regional bias in India's sort of thinking about the world. The foundational assumption I think that there is in India is that India is essentially a regional power. Its sort of priorities, its interests lie in the region. The other things, what happens to the rest of the world, is all fantastic. It's all good. But that's luxury. The what happens in the neighborhood, what happens in the region is existential. So I think its operational imagination is somehow bounded by the subcontinental and its immediate periphery, as it were. So the strategic focus, therefore, is first on Pakistan, then on China, and then a little to the neighborhood, and then now to a little bit to the Indian Ocean region. We are not yet into the Indo-Pacific conversation in a strategically definitive sense of the term. So the Pakistan focus is something that I'm sure Anit will agree with me, be it in the university curricula, think tank projects, or in the policy community. The conversation is primarily on Pakistan. I think in the recent past, we made a shift towards China. So the obsession on Pakistan is somewhat reduced, but Pakistan, of course, would not let us let India go past it. Therefore, there is always this going back to the Pakistan question. So therefore, what happens is that there's less rigorous thinking on great power balancing in the classical sense, how a rising power positions itself within, how it reshapes the international. Those questions are somewhat absent in the Indian thinking. It happens at a very, broad, desirable level, but at a practical, how do you sort of build a grand strategy around those questions? That sort of doesn't happen. I'll end with one more quick point, actually two quick points, Dan. And I want to sort of caveat this neighborhood obsession, by saying that there is also a certain continental obsession within India's neighborhood obsession, which is that because India has fought its land wars in the past, it has never fought a war with in the sort of maritime domain, the maritime theater, and therefore there is a continental obsession in India's strategic thinking. Maritime is as if India is a landlocked country. The maritime does not sort of spring to the Indian imagination when it thinks about its neighborhood. So therefore, its theory of deterrence, its sort of theory of escalation, its theory of risk analysis, all of that have been in some sense driven by this continental obsession, and not focused on the maritime domain, the theater at all. And finally, I think India also somehow believes, and that shapes India's understanding of escalation, risk, and constraints. It also tends to believe that it is a responsible actor, or it wants to behave like a responsible actor. And because it believes it is a responsible actor, it wants to behave like a responsible actor, you will always see low risk appetite masquerading as prudence. Right, and we say we are a prudent country. That's also probably because there's low risk appetite. In the Indian strategic thinking, it is theorized as prudence, strategic autonomy, non-escalation, responsible statecraft, and that I think probably is a function in some ways of the low risk appetite. So the instinct, therefore, is something happens out there. The instinct is to wait, hedge, and preserve your choice, as it were. You don't want to make a call at this point of time. Wait for it. But anyway, I've sort of spoken enough. Back to you, Dan.
Fascinating points, and it leads me to wonder whether India's emphasis on the regional and continental is in some ways connected with its sense of risk and risk aversion, but also whether the extent to which all of this may have to or be in the process of changing, given that the maritime space is one where India will see significant competition, at least with China, in the years to come. And that raises other questions, which we don't have to get into at the moment, but certainly on my mind, about the extent to which, if we're talking about sort of the ancient and the modern, there have been other times in Indian history where the maritime space was incredibly important, especially in terms of trade and connectivity with other parts of the world. And so rediscovering that, as I think Anit put it earlier, rediscovering some of that history presumably will be, or maybe already is, a part of new Indian strategic thinking about the world. But that's just me. Anit, over to you. I want to bring it back around a little bit to some of your thinking. You can comment on anything we've talked about already, but just draw again on, in particular, your experience having studied in the United States. And you were here in SAIS. SAIS wasn't in this physical location, but you were at SAIS, so spiritually in the same place. And you're probably sitting in classrooms where you heard American professors talking about strategy. And I'm hoping that maybe some things struck you as odd or maybe misplaced from an Indian perspective. What American strategists or teaching or thinking about strategy, in a sense, gets wrong or is wrong from an Indian perspective. So if you want to run with that or pick up on some other pieces, feel free.
Thank you so much for that. That's a really good question. So I'll kind of circle back to what's unique about America first, because I was in a classroom with Mara, Colin back in the day, and we both were in the same, we did the masters at the same point of time. And I saw all my classmates go on to have careers in government in different sectors and dealing with global issues. And I was somewhat jealous, very proud, but jealous. But it gave me a perspective that if you study strategic studies in the US, there are exciting jobs available and open to you that will grow your mind intellectually and give you opportunities that do not exist for most students of strategic studies outside the US. And I say this carefully, for most students who study strategic studies outside the US, those kind of jobs, those kind of experiences are not easy to come by. It is possible, but you have to be either politically well connected or you have to be established as some sort of an expert who is picked up somewhere. Even in the UK, it's not easy for someone to study strategic studies at King's College and then suddenly have a career where you're in a think tank, in the government, in academia. That sort of kind of rotation is rare outside the US. So that's one insight which I had. Now, this is a double-edged sword, right? As you know yourself, Dan, right? I mean, when there are politically appointed bureaucrats, it can work to their advantage to reinvent the state every 4 years. But it can also be a double-edged sword, because if you are having politically appointed bureaucrats that exist at all bureaucracies at all levels, then suddenly political considerations would shape who gets to be that bureaucrat. And they can reshape institutions, as I'm sure all of you are aware of right now in the US. And that can be detrimental too. So it's a double-edged sword. So that was the kind of insight I had. In terms of what I would have thought was different about kind of strategic studies was, again, I was struck by the smartness of all the people that I studied with and studied from. So there's no doubting that. I learned a lot from them. I owe everything to them. But I was also struck a little bit by how their views of the region, and that is possibly including true in the UK today, how their views of the region are so outdated, that they don't kind of go back and forth as much as I would have liked them to do back in 2004, 2005. I know it's changed a lot. I mean, you are a part of the faculty. So is Josh White, who is in on the call. You both have experience of working within the government, of being frequently back in India, of engaging the Indian government and academia. So you bring a certain insight. But back in the day, in 2003, 2005, we didn't have as many people who were deeply wedded. And that speaks to the weakness of growing strategic studies as a discipline. So even now, even to this day, it is dominated mostly by, as was observed earlier, by kind of retired officers or bureaucrats. And there are very few genuine civilian scholars who can actually grow strategic studies, not IR, strategic studies. And that because of the state is inhibiting the growth of strategic studies. I kind of end over here. Thank you.
On for those insights. I have more questions, but I think we've reached 12:30 almost exactly. So I do want to open the floor to those who are here in the room. Let's see, Stephanie, you know what we're doing
The
here.
video.
Okay, so we can turn on the video.
That should work.
So now you can kind of see me. Great. And then presumably this is going to pan over to somebody. We'll see what happens. Okay. So who's got a question for our audience? Yeah, we've got one right in the front. If you can say your name or anything else about yourself, and
Yes.
hopefully they can hear you.
Okay, so my name is Sanjana. I'm a first year MAIR student. And I have a question kind of about India's civil military. And even in our classes, and I know who this is going to go to as well. But even in our classes, just seeing the passivity of the civil military, how that's kind of affected the defense doctrine. India doesn't have a specific defense doctrine as well. Like there's cold start and they've done some things, but we're not seeing a cohesive thing. So I kind of just wanted to learn more about that.
Did our panelists hear the question? Yes, you could hear the question. Good. Okay. So you said you knew who this was going to. Did you
Yes,
assume
I
it's
do.
going to Anna?
Yes.
Okay. Anna, you get first bite, but if others want to jump in, they're welcome.
Thank you so much. Civil relations is undergoing a lot of churn, as everything in India. So very quickly, you're right. India doesn't. I mean, it's got different doctrines. But actually, the one good positive aspect nowadays is the Indian armed forces is increasingly open to publishing a lot and engaging with academia. So that's a shift, but engaging on its own terms. And so there are increasing doctrines being published by the Integrated Defense Staff. So you'll find different doctrines. But what India does not have is a national, it's a national security strategy. And that's an old bugbear that people keep complaining that India does not have a national security strategy. If you were to ask me personally, I think it's a moot point. I don't think that India actually needs a national security strategy because any bureaucracy anywhere knows what its challenges are and what is expected to be done. I think it's a debate. I mean, I'm not convinced whether we actually even need a national security strategy to kind of ask me, because there might be diplomatic costs associated with that. And if you read the national security strategy of most countries, they're mostly inane, large picture stuff that don't really give specific instructions to the bureaucracies. I don't know if that answers your question, because I didn't hear the part that you asked, you kind of were keen to ask of me.
Restate the second.
Yes, I think it was vague about that. I think the reason I asked about nationals, about this kind of framing and whether they have a doctrine is like a lot of the times these documents just serve as narrative framing and taking more ownership and more space of telling your own story. Because if you don't do it, then someone else is gonna do it and they're gonna do it in their way. And that immediately delineates power. So like not even coming from the perspective of, oh, like we need, like the bureaucracy knows what to do, but coming from this perspective of not having other people like explain your story to you or use it in a way against you. So coming from that perspective is why I was kind of talking about doctrine or national security strategy. And you mentioned the low risk appetite as well. So I would love to hear your perspective about that too.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I do take your point. I think that there is a gradual understanding in India that they need to, especially after Operation of Sindoor, that they need to do a better job of engaging with different institutions, with foreign agencies, with media, and they need to be better at trying to get their story out and kind of not just assume that what they tell will be kind of consumed for inspection. But on your point is you're right. We don't have a written cold start doctrine. It is presumed as a cold start doctrine based on verbal announcements, but there's no written doctrine saying this is the cold start doctrine. And I think that is a shortcoming. Thank you.
Okay, go ahead.
Hi, my name is Joe Clark. I'm an MAIR student, first year. Question that I had was about India's relationship with the Arab Gulf states. There are a lot of Indian workers in Arab Gulf states. Many of them occupy very high positions of power. And I was wondering if India sees the Arab Gulf states as something that they can use this issue to leverage with, maybe a potential liability, and maybe what they think about how this might factor in with the current war going on.
Great question. Rahul, since you're normally sitting in one of those Gulf states, maybe you have some thoughts on how India perceives them as relations, potential leverage, and so
on. Yeah, I'm inclined to defer to Hapimon on this, as he's more on the sort of intricacies of day-to-day actual policy making, and I'm slightly bound by the fact that this is recorded. And but let me say, India has complex relations with the Gulf. It isn't clear cut because there are significant divisions amongst even the Arab states in the Gulf region on how they want to pursue modernization, how they want to pursue trade, whether those are their priorities, and who they see as their sort of net provider of security. And so each of those factors have to be thought about with each individual Gulf state. And so the one that I know the best, the UAE, for instance, and to some degree this is true for Saudi, is that they have had an increasingly constructive important strategic relationship with India and a significant change over the last 10 or 12 years. The UAE in particular signed a strategic partnership agreement with India. And so their relations are diverse, depending on the state we're talking about. With the UAE in particular, it's an incredibly productive and rapidly moving relationship. The UAE is now, I think, India's third largest trading partner, and India is the UAE's largest trading partner. So there's a significant amount of agreement on matters of terrorism, security, and intelligence sharing, on cross investment and the movement, as you were asking, as Joe was asking in his question, the movement of particularly of skilled professionals and workers between the countries. But where all of India's relationship with the broader region goes really depends on the decisions these different Gulf states are going to make in the coming years about whether they line up, for instance, with India's broad vision for the region, the idea that the US, Israel, the UAE, and India will form this chain that will try and push for trade and interdependence as a way of managing challenges in the region. If other Gulf states sign on, it'll be far more plausible to see them working alongside India. But that requires each of them to make a decision, and each of them has a different ethnic, religious, and geostrategic sort of set of circumstances that they have to think about. So I don't want to give you an answer for every single one of them, but as far as the UAE goes, the relationship has been incredibly productive and successful.
Shall I come in? Sorry, yes.
Yeah, I'm gonna one more question and then give you the chance to. Why don't we go ahead and run through this and then go ahead.
Hello, my name is Raghav Agarwal. I'm a second-year Master's of Arts in International Relations student here, and I'll be joining the U.S. Foreign Service after graduation. My question was more related to how you feel the hiring practices of the Indian Foreign Service and the Ministry of Defense and others, which, correct me if I'm wrong, are very generalist based on a more uniform civil service exam. How could a transition to perhaps a more direct hiring pathway for a specific foreign service officer test or specific job postings within each ministry help contribute to the development of IR and strategic studies as a field within India, with the direct rotation, the more availability of direct jobs for students who choose to pursue or specialize in strategic studies, defense topics, or other parts of international relations?
Good, very practical question as well. So Habiman, if you want to pick up something about West Asia, and then also if you're comfortable about this question of hiring practices within the Indian Foreign Service. If not, we can maybe pick the second one up for Anand or Rahul.
Thank you. Very quickly on the West Asia / Middle East question, I'm not so sure that the Indian diaspora being present in the Middle East in large numbers actually is a leverage for India. The leverage of the diaspora, I would say, works probably in the United States and in Europe. The Indian diaspora being there because they are well-to-do, they are politically connected, they have political power. So under normal circumstances, ordinarily it works in India's favor. Let's say, hypothetically speaking, certainly it hasn't worked in times of Trump, but that's a completely different matter altogether. But I would assume that ordinarily, if there is Indian diaspora in significant numbers in the United States and in Europe, that it can be used as some kind of a leverage by the Indian state if usefully. If properly utilized, but that does not work in the case of the Middle East. One, because I think it is also due to the nature of the politics in the Middle East. You're not really looking at the Indian citizens going there and becoming citizens of those countries. They do their work and they come back, they send remittance home, and that's about it. They don't have any political power there. They don't have any say in the scheme of things there, let alone in the strategic decision making of those countries. And therefore, I don't think there's any leverage. I would probably go one step further and say what we actually have is probably a little bit of a liability and not leverage. And why do I say that? If there is a problem in the Middle East, as is the case today, you have a lot of Indians worried about their jobs. And if there is going to be a return of a lot of the millions of Indians working there, that's going to be a burden on the Indian state in order to provide for them in some way, right? I mean, the remittances that is coming from there, all of that is going to be a problem. The energy flow. So I think the during times of crisis, the Indian diaspora in the Middle East probably becomes more of a liability than a leverage. That's at least my opinion, the way I see it. Coming to the question of the hiring practices of the Indian Foreign Service, I mean, many of us have been telling the government in various shapes and forms in our arguments with the government that there should be one specialized recruitment of the foreign service officers. That hasn't happened. We have a general exam, and as I said, about 1 million people apply for those for that particular exam, the Union Public Service Commission examination, and about until last year, you had 32 seats or 34 seats in the Indian Foreign Service. For the first time this year, we had an intake of about 45 or 46, somewhere around 50 individuals got selected to the Indian Foreign Service this year. Probably they're going to increase to maybe 50, 60, 65. That's not going to increase. I don't think there is much appetite within the Indian Foreign Service to increase the numbers for obvious reasons. If you have too many people, not everyone gets to become an ambassador, right? There's also that problem. But I would say that there is a new practice of consultants within the MEA, within the Ministry of External Affairs. So you have fresh PhDs from the universities going into the system, spending a few years there, working under a joint secretary or an associate secretary, and getting some domain knowledge and coming back into the academia or in the think tank world. But other than that, there is very little, let's say, interface between the academia, the think tank community, with the Indian Foreign Service, as it were, the Ministry of External Affairs, which should change, but it hasn't changed. I don't see this going to change anytime soon.
I see a question over there.
Thank you so much. Indian MAI student. Dr. Jacob, I'm actually an alumni of Chicago University. I left right before you sort of joined. So it's a good seeing you here. Sort of going back to the strategic narrative. About
They're not hearing. Can you hear me? Hear me?
We can hear you.
Okay. Do me a favor, do you want to come down here? This way, they'll see you and hear you. And now you can do it.
I sort of wanted to ask a question about the Mahasagar strategy, and again, taking this back to the maritime security conversation that we were having, and the sort of strategic thinking conversation. Why expand? First of all, why have a maritime security strategy and then expand it to sort of this ambitious global sort of level? One, in that framing, and two, in sort of the intent capability framing. Clearly, the capabilities are not there to sort of be a net security provider in all of the Indo-Pacific, right? But it's framed that way. So why is the narrative taking that form, and what's that disconnect with the capability? So just why do it at all?
Happy Man, you want to jump on that?
Yeah, very quickly. Let me put it this way. I think if having or pushing for a maritime strategy is not really an ambitious project in my sort of reckoning, because it is your neighborhood. It is India's strategic periphery. You go to have a strategy for the maritime theater. Look at India's map. If you look at the Indian map from the Rann of Kutch to Jammu and Kashmir and to the Bay of Bengal, along the international border, the line of control and the line of actual control, what you have basically is a holding operation, right? I mean, you have Pakistan and China. You can't get through to these countries to the rest of the world. And you have the other smaller neighbors. Bangladesh is now, of course, it has a better relationship with India than say 6 months ago. But Myanmar is where it is. Bhutan is getting close to China. Nepal is a landlocked country. So in some ways, you're looking at a land border, or let's say continental theater, which doesn't really allow India to access the rest of the world. Now, if you sort of look at the Indian, that is 15,000 kilometers of India's borders. Now, look at the Indian borders from the Rann of Kutch downwards to the south and to the Bay of Bengal. You have 11,000 kilometers of maritime borders, and these borders actually is where the future is, right? I mean, all your FTAs, the free trade agreements are being signed with countries that are, let's say, near or far in your maritime space. It is not with Afghanistan or with Central Asia. The opportunities that India has, strategically speaking, are in the maritime space. So the opportunity is one thing. The entire Indo-Pacific space imagination is in the maritime space. And finally, you have a neighborhood that is the Indian Ocean region. I just came back from Mauritius, for the Indian Ocean Conference, and you have in Mauritius, the National Security Advisor is an Indian official. You have such a expansive security and strategic partnership with Mauritius, and that sort of conversation hardly takes place in Delhi about Mauritius, about Seychelles, about the sort of Indian Ocean Rim Association. None of that takes place in Delhi. It's all about the obsession with Pakistan, now a little bit on China. I think India needs to break out of that and move into a space where there is opportunity, there is economic and strategic opportunity, and something and into a space that doesn't really hold you back, allows you to sort of expand and sort of connect with other countries strategically and otherwise. Back to that.
Thank you, Adnan. Anna, did you want to jump on that, or no? We have another question.
Hi, I'm Keisuke Nakajima, MIPB student. I'm also with Japan Air Self-Defense Force. And the Japan Air Self-Defense Force currently trained with Indian Air Force, and also with Japan had been deepening the exchange with Indian Armed Force. I would like to gain your insight on the specific area where the Japan's Self-Defense Force and the Indian Armed Force can further strengthen their cooperation in the future.
Great. So opportunities for Japan and India on defense cooperation. Anna, can I put this one on you?
Yeah, very quickly. I think that the sky is the limit. India is very interested in exploring opportunities for defense cooperation, co-production, but I think the problems are mainly on the Japanese side. The kind of reluctance to either share technology and I think there is something in the works which they're doing with the Navy. That again, I've gone on a very quick trip to kind of NIDS. Doesn't make me an expert on Japan by any chance. It's just my second time to Tokyo. But I'm interested in that topic. I think it's up to our imagination to take it where we would want it to go. So I think it'll be interesting to see what sort of technology, what sort of interest is there on the Japanese side. I think when I speak to people in the armed forces, they are very gung-ho, very optimistic, and have no problems in cooperating with Japan, and would welcome cooperation on things like naval cooperation, anti-submarine warfare drills, which the Japanese are extremely good at. So I think it's really a hostage to our imagination. Thanks.
Great. I think we have time for a last question. Is there any more? Another one. Go ahead.
There's no one else.
I think we're good and no one online. So,
if there were we talked about strategic texts before, but if you wanted to go for a more antiquated, more classical document that a strategy and policy class would teach in addition to Karl von Clausewitz and Sun Tzu, what text would you pick?
Oh, I'm going to turn it to you. Ancient text, and then if others want to jump in on this one, they're welcome.
Yeah, everyone's going to have a favorite that they like. Habimon was referring to something called the Tirukal, or implicitly sort of referring to there's multiple texts that are excellent, but the one that I'm partial to, again, it's available in English translation, and the reason I like it is it's incredibly short. It's called the Brihaspati Sutra. I'll send the citation on to Dan, and he can pass it on to you. It's called the Brihaspati Sutra. It's the oldest of the strategic texts, more than 3,000 years old, and it has 25 lines. That's it on strategy. It's 25 lines on defense, 25 on economics, 25 on politics. It's a short document. It's about 150 lines in total, and the 25 lines summarize and become the seed for subsequent strategic thought in the Indian ancient world, and they all emphasize the importance of economics as the basis of military power. If you don't get the economic base right, you won't get anything else right. And so that's one key part of the lesson. And the second is that rulers must be advised well, which has been the theme of our discussion today. That the saying, the line, if I remember it exactly right, is ministers are the pillars that hold up the temple of the state. So no good ministers, you can have all the wealth and you can have a powerful ruler, but no good ministers lead to no good outcomes. So money, resources, and prudence or expertise are essential. That's what the Brihaspati Sutra teaches, and I recommend it because it's so short and so clear.
Thank you. That's a great kind of an text for us to refer to. Maybe I'll go around the horn. Habibon, do you have a favorite text that you might like to recommend?
Since we have a Japanese student in the room, I would say the Indo-Pacific, the confluence of two oceans, was picked up by the former Japanese Prime Minister from Dara Shiko's book. It's called the Majma ul Bahrain. Am I pronouncing that correctly, Rahul? But it's a mingling of the two oceans, written in 1655. It sort of talks about the syncretic tradition. You're talking about the son of a Mughal emperor writing this in the 17th century, and I'm talking about the synthetic traditions and talking about strategy in a sort of indirect manner. I thought that was a very interesting, because in my sort of trying to dig up Indian strategic culture, I go back to some of these traditions. And I thought this particular one was of great utility to me, especially after the Japanese Prime Minister picked this idea up for his speech in the Indian Parliament when he sort of came out with the Indo-Pacific coinage, as it were. So I would point you to some of the writings in the Mughal tradition, because sometimes that's also something that's very ignored in the Indian context these days, given the provenance, as it were. But yes, back to you.
Amazing. Anit, do you have anything?
On the ancient text, I never read the ancient text, which is probably my own fault of being A, in the military, and B, at SAIS. So I didn't read any of the ancient texts. So I would have nothing to recommend. The one that does come to mind is not really ancient, but Tagore's essays on kind of nationalism. Again, Bengali, I'm partial to Tagore, so I will obviously have to talk about Tagore. But his essays, I think, offer a very different vision of what kind of nationalism could have existed, but does not exist in the world anymore. I think it'll be interesting to kind of go through that, because it tells you about the fork in the road that not just India, but all of us, all over the world, have taken with our vision of nationalism, which at this time is very aggressive and it's got very sharp elbows, as we all know. Thanks.
Thank you, Anit. An appropriate way to bring us to a close. I would just observe that my own view is sort of strategic thinking, canons, these sorts of things. They're always works in progress. This is true for the United States. It's definitely true for India. India as a as a nation on the move, in many ways a rising power on the world stage, is in the process of some invention, some rediscovery, and the combination of these two is what's going on, and certainly in Delhi and across the country, and given our three speakers around the world as well. And if I dare say, maybe the strategic canon of India may include one or more of our speakers here today, with the benefit of hindsight and in retrospect, we'll be reading their work for years to come. So please, for those of you in the room, join me in thanking our three speakers who have joined us from far away at various times of the day or night. We really appreciate it, and this has been recorded, so we'll look forward to sharing it more publicly in the months and years to come. So thank you.